The establishment of the Office of National Intelligence Programs Evaluation, NIPE, in 1963 was the first major effort by a Director of Central Intelligence, DCI, to ensure consistent contact and coordination with the community. Yet from the outset, McCone accepted the limitations on his authority, although Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara agreed to provide him with access to the Defense Department budget, which still constitutes 80% of the intelligence community's overall budget. McCone could not direct or control the intelligence components of the other departments. The NIPE staff directed most of its attention to sorting out intelligence requirements through the United States Intelligence Board and attempting to develop a national inventory for the community, including budget, personnel, and materials. Remarkably, this had never before been done. The most pressing problem for the community was the adjustment to the impact of technical collection capabilities. The large budgetary resources involved and the value of the data generated by overhead reconnaissance systems precipitated a major bureaucratic battle over their administration and control. From 1963 to 1965, much of McCone's and their senior NIPE staff officers' community efforts were directed toward working out an agreement with the Air Force on development, production, and deployment of overhead reconnaissance systems. In 1961, the agency and the Air Force had established a working relationship for overhead reconnaissance systems through a central administrative office, whose director reported to the Secretary of Defense, but accepted intelligence requirements through USIB. By informal agreement, the Air Force provided launchers, bases, and recovery capabilities for reconnaissance systems, while the agency was responsible for research, development, contracting, and security. Essentially, the agreement allowed the agency to decide which systems would be deployed, and the Air Force challenged the CIA's jurisdiction. A primary mission was at stake in these negotiations, and the struggle was fierce on both sides. Controlled by one agency or another did not involve only budgets and manpower. Since the Air Force and CIA missions were very different, a decision would affect the nature of the reconnaissance program itself, tactical or national intelligence priorities, the frequency and location of overflights, and the use of data. The agreement that emerged in 1965 attempted to balance the interests of both the Air Force and the CIA. A three-person executive committee, EXCOM, for the administration of overhead reconnaissance was established. Its members included the DCI, an Assistant Secretary of Defense, and the President's scientific advisor. The EXCOM reported to the Secretary of Defense, who was assigned primary administrative authority for overhead reconnaissance systems. The end of page 123, beginning page 124. Arrangement recognized the DCI's authority as head of the community to establish collection requirements in consultation with the USIB. It also gave him responsibility for processing and utilizing data generated by overhead reconnaissance. In the event that he did not agree with a decision made by the Secretary of Defense, the DCI was given the right to appeal to the President. The agreement represented a compromise between the Air Force and CIA claims and provided substantive recognition of the DCI's national intelligence responsibility. As a structure for decision-making, it has worked well. However, it has not rectified the inherent competition over technical collection systems that has come to motivate the intelligence process. The development of these systems has created intense rivalry, principally between the Air Force and the agency, over program deployments. With so much money and manpower at stake, with each new system, each organization is eager to gain the benefits of successful contracting. As a result, the accepted solution to problems with the intelligence product has come to be more collection rather than better analysis. After 1965, efforts to impose some direction on the community did not receive consistent attention from directors of Central Intelligence, Raborn and Helms. The DCI's priorities, coupled with the inherent bureaucratic obstacles and the burden of Vietnam, relegated the problem of coordination to a low priority. 3. The intelligence function. Internally, the agency was also adjusting to the impact of technical and scientific advances. In 1963, the Directorate for Science and Technology, DDS&T, was created. Previously, scientific and technical intelligence production had been scattered among the other three directorates. The process of organizing an independent directorate meant wresting manpower and resources from the existing components. Predictably, the resistance was considerable, and a year and a half passed between the first attempts at creating the directorate and its actual establishment. The new component included the Office of Scientific Intelligence and the Office of ELINT, Electronic Intercepts, from DDI, the Data Processing Staff from DDA, the Development Projects Division, responsible for overhead reconnaissance, from the DDP, a newly created Office of Research and Development. Later in 1963, the Foreign Missile and Space Analysis Center was added. The Directorate's specific functions include, and continue to include, research, development, operation, data reduction, analysis, contributions to national intelligence estimates. The Directorate was organized on the premise that close cooperation should exist between research and application on the one hand, and technical collection and analysis on the other. This close coordination, along with the staffing and career patterns in the Directorate, have contributed to the continuing vitality and quality of the DDS&T's work. The DDP began and remained a close, self-contained component. The DDI evolved into a closed, self-contained component. That was the DDI. However, the DDS&T was created with the assumption that it would continue to rely on the expertise and advice from outside the agency. A number of end of page 124, beginning with page 125. Arrangements ensured constant interchanges between the Directorate and the scientific and industrial communities. First, since all research and development for technical systems was done through contracting, the DDS&T could draw on and benefit from the most advanced technical systems nationwide. Second, to attract high-quality professionals from the industrial and scientific communities, the Directorate established a competitive salary scale. The result has been personal mobility between the DDS&T and private industry. It has not been unusual for individuals to leave the private industry, assume positions with the DDS&T for several years, then return to private industry. This pattern has provided the Directorate with a constant infusion and renewal of talent. Finally, the Directorate established the practice of regularly employing advisory groups, as well as fostering DDS&T staff participation in conferences and seminars sponsored by professional associations. The agency's intelligence capabilities expanded in another direction. Although in the 1953 to 1961 period, the agency had made some contributions to military intelligence, it had not openly challenged the Defense Department's prerogative in this area. In the early 1960s, that opportunity came. By 1962, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara's dissatisfaction with the quality of ministry estimates led him to begin tapping the agency's analytic capabilities. Specifically, McNamara requested special estimates from the agency and included agency personnel in community-wide exercises and long-term Soviet force projections. McNamara's initiatives provided the CIA with leverage against military services dominance in strategic intelligence. The Secretary's actions, together with McCone's insistence on the DCI's need for independent judgments on military matters, resulted in the agency's expanded analytic effort in strategic intelligence. In 1962, the Office of Current Intelligence established a military intelligence division, and 5 years later, the military intelligence units of OCI and ORR were combined into a separate office, the Office of Strategic Research, OSR. During this period, economic intelligence grew in importance. The decade of the 1950s, economic research had concentrated on analysis related to the Soviet Union and its, quote, satellites, end quote. With the emergence of independent African nations in the early 1960s, and the view that the USSR would engage in political and economic penetration of the fledgling governments, demands for information on the economies of these countries developed. Likewise, the growing economic strength of Japan and countries of Western Europe produced a related decline in the U.S. competitive posture and reflected the growing inadequacy of the dollar-dominated international monetary system. Economic analysts found themselves called upon for detailed research on these countries as trading partners and rivals of the United States. In 1967, an independent Office of Economic Research, OER, succeeded ORR. 4. The paramilitary surge. The clandestine service continued to dominate the agency's activities during this period. In budget, manpower, and degree of DCI attention accorded to DDP, clandestine operations remained the CIA's most consuming mission. The policies and operational preferences, end of page 125, beginning page 126, of the executive branch dictated the agency's emphasis in clandestine activities. Evidence of communist guerrilla activities in Southeast Asia and Africa convinced Kennedy and his closest advisors of the need for the United States to develop an unconventional warfare capability. Quote, counterinsurgency, end quote, as the U.S. effort was designated, aimed at preventing communist-supported military victories without participating as a major Soviet-American military confrontation. As part of this effort, the agency, under the direction of the Kennedy administration, initiated paramilitary operations in Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam. Following the Bay of Pigs, attempts to undermine the government of Cuba Premier Fidel Castro continued with Operation Mongoose. Conducted between October 1961 and October 1962, Mongoose consisted of paramilitary, sabotage, and political propaganda activities. The agency's large-scale involvement in Southeast Asia began in 1962 with programs in Laos and South Vietnam. In Laos, the agency implemented their air supply and paramilitary training programs, which gradually developed into full-scale management of a ground war. Between 1962 and 1965, the agency worked with the South Vietnamese government to organize police forces and paramilitary units. In the remainder of the decade, Vietnam dominated the CIA, just as it did other government agencies. In both the DDP and the DDI, the CIA's resources were directed towards supporting and evaluating the U.S. effort in Vietnam. For the agency and the DCI, it was a contradictory position, one which left the institution and the man vulnerable to the pressures of conflict purposes. On the one hand, the DDP was supporting a major paramilitary operation which at its peak in 1970 involved 700 people, 600 of whom were stationed in Vietnam, the rest at headquarters. Footnote 9. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 9. By 1965, the demands for personnel were so great that each DDP component was levied on a quota basis to contribute personnel. Resuming the reading. Stated in other terms, 12% of the DDP's manpower was devoted to Vietnam. Clearly, the agency's stake in the operational side of the war was significant. At the same time, the analysts were also drawn into the war. After the initiation of the bombing campaign against North Vietnam in 1965, the agency began receiving requests for assessments of the campaign's impact. By 1966, both the Office of Research and Reports and the Office of Current Intelligence had established special staffs to deal with Vietnam. In addition, the Special Assistance for Vietnam Affairs, SAVA, staff was created under the direction of the DCI. The total number of DDI analysts involved was 69. While the DDP effort was increasing in proportion to the American military buildup, the DDI estimates painted a pessimistic view of the likelihood of U.S. success with successive escalations in the ground and air wars. Footnote 10. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 10. There were exceptions to this. The Sava group produced some positive estimates of the bombing. Resuming the reading. At no time was the institutional dichotomy between the operational and analytical components more stark. The agency's involvement in Southeast Asia had long-term effects on the institution. In particular, it had determined the second generation. End of page 126. Beginning page 127. Leadership group within the agency. By 1970, the first generation of the agency careerists was beginning to reach retirement age, and vacancies were opening in senior level positions. In both the DDP and the DDI, many of those positions were filled by individuals who had distinguished themselves in Southeast Asia-related activities. In clandestine service, men who spent considerable time in the Far East have gone on to become a former DCI, the present Deputy Director for Operations, footnote 11, and the present Chief of the Western Hemisphere Division, the Chief of the Counterintelligence Staff, and the present Deputy Chief of the Soviet/East European Division. Pausing the reading, reading footnote 11. In 1973, DCI James Schlesinger changed the name of the clandestine service from the Directorate for Plans to the Directorate for Operations, DDO. Resuming the reading. On the DDI side, the present Assistant Deputy Director for Intelligence and Chief National Intelligence Officer, footnote 12, were all involved in Vietnam assessments at the height of the war. Clearly, the rewards were inconsiderable for participation in a major operation. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 12. See page 123 of this section for a discussion of the National Intelligence Officers. Resuming the reading. The decade of the 1960s brought increased attention to the problem of coordinating intelligence activities in the community, but illustrated the complex difficulties involved in effective management. The departmental claims the orientation of the DCI, the role accorded him by the President, and the demands of clandestine operations all affected the execution of the coordination role. Although policymakers were inconsistent in their utilization of the agency's intelligence analysis capability, all continued to heavily rely on CIA's operational capability in support of their policies. That fact established the agency's own priorities and reinforced the existing internal incentives. Despite the agency's growing sophistication and investment in technological systems, the clandestine activities continue to constitute the major share of the agency's budget and personnel. Between 1962 and 1970, the DDP budget averaged 52% of the agency's total annual budget. Footnote 13. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 13. This does not include the proportion of the DDA budget that supported the DDP activities. Resuming the reading. Likewise, in the same period, 55% of full-time agency personnel were assigned to DDP activities. Footnote 14. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 14. This figure includes those individuals in the communications and logistics components of the DDA, whose activities were in direct support of the DDP mission. Resuming the reading. Essentially, the pattern of activity that had begun to emerge in the early 1950s and that became firmly established under the Doles continued. D. The recent past, 1971 to 1975. The years 1971 to 1975 were a period of transition and abrupt change for the CIA. The scale of covert operations declined, and in the executive branch and at the senior level of the agency, growing concern developed over the quality of the intelligence products and the management of the intelligence community's resources. However, external pressures overshadowed initial attempts at reform. End of page 127, beginning page 128. By the start of the decade, broad changes had evolved in American foreign policy. Dispensation over Vietnam, the Congress's more assertive role in foreign policy, and shifts in the international power structure had eroded the assumptions on which U.S. foreign policy had been based. Consensus that had existed among the press, informed public, Congress, and the executive branch that had both supported and protected the CIA broke down. As conflicting policy preferences emerged, and as misconduct in the executive branch was revealed, the CIA, once exempt from public examination, became subject to close scrutiny. One, the Directors of Central Intelligence, 1973 to 1975. James R. Schlesinger's tenure as DCI from February to July 1973 was brief but significant. An economist by training and long an observer of the intelligence community through his extensive experience in national security affairs, Schlesinger came to the CIA with definite ideas on restructuring the management of the community and improving the quality of intelligence. During his 6-month term, he embarked on changes that promised to alter the DCI's and the agency's existing priorities. William E. Colby succeeded Schlesinger, an attorney, OSS veteran, and career DDP officer. Colby's background made him seem of the traditional operations school in the agency. His overseas assignments included positions in Rome, Stockholm, and Saigon, where he was chief of station. Yet Colby brought an agency-wide community orientation to his term as DCI that was uncommon for DDP careerists. Soon after his appointment, the agency became the focus of public and congressional inquiries, and most of Colby's time was absorbed in responding to these developments. 2. Efforts at change. Foreign affairs were a continuing priority in the Nixon administration until 1971. Vietnam absorbed most of the time and attention of the president and his assistant for national security affairs. Henry Kissinger, after 1971, both turned to a redefinition of U.S. foreign policy. Sharing a global view of U.S. policy, the two men sought to restructure their relationships with the Soviet Union and with the People's Republic of China. It was Kissinger rather than Richard Helms who served as President Nixon's intelligence officer. Kissinger provided Nixon with daily briefings and relied on the staff of the National Security Council for intelligence analysis. Both men's preference for working with, and often independently of, small, tightly managed staffs is well known. However, both were genuinely interested in obtaining more and better quality intelligence from the CIA. In December 1970, Nixon requested a study of the intelligence community. Executed by James Schlesinger, then Assistant Director of the Bureau of the Budget, the study resulted in the Presidential Directive of November 5, 1971. Assigning the DCI responsibility for review of the intelligence community budget. The intention was that the DCI would advise the President on community-wide budgetary allocations by serving in a last review capacity. The effort faltered for two reasons. First, Nixon chose not to request congressional enactment of revised legislation extending the authority of the DCI. End the decision, end of page 128, beginning page 129, inherently limited the DCI's ability to exert control over the intelligence components. Thus, the DCI was once again left to arbitrate as one among equals. Second, the implementation of the directive was less energetic and decisive than it might have been. Helms did not attempt to make recommendations on budgetary allocations, and instead presented the President with agreed views of the representatives of the departmental intelligence components. Furthermore, within the agency, a mechanism for assisting the DCI in community matters was weak. Early in 1972, Helms established the Intelligence Community IC staff as a replacement for the NIPE staff to assist in community matters. Between the time of the decision to create such a staff and its actual organization, the number of personnel assigned was halved. It is likely that had James Schlesinger remained as DCI, he would have assumed a vigorous role in the community, and it would have attempted to exercise the DCI's implied authority. Schlesinger altered the composition of the IC staff by reducing the number of CIA personnel and increasing the number of non-agency personnel. To facilitate the staff's contacts with the community, Schlesinger's primary concern was upgrading the quality of the agency's intelligence analysis, and he had begun to consider changes in the Office of National Estimates. In addition, he made considerable reductions in personnel, with most of the cuts occurring in the DDO. Footnote 14a. Pausing the reading footnote 14a. See footnote, page 121. Resuming the reading. Under Colby, attempts at innovation continued. Colby abolished the Office of National Estimates and replaced it with a group of 11 senior specialists in functional geographical areas known as National Intelligence Officers, NIOs. NIOs are responsible for intelligence collection and production in their designated fields, and the senior NIO is directly responsible to the DCI. The purpose of the NIO system was to establish better communication and interchange between policymakers and analysts than had been the case with the Office of National Estimates. These changes were accompanied by shifts in emphasis in the DDO and the DDI. And the clandestine service scale of covert operations was reduced, and by 1972, the agency's paramilitary program in Southeast Asia was dissolved. Yet, the overall reduction did not affect the fundamental assumptions, organization, and incentives governing the DDO. Indeed, in 1975, clandestine activities still constituted 37% of the agency's total budget. Footnote 15. Pausing the reading footnote 15. This does not include DDA budgetary allocations in support of DDO activities. Resuming the reading. The rationale remains the same, and the operational capability is intact, as CIA activities in Chile illustrated. While Soviet strategic capabilities remain the first priority for clandestine collection requirements, in response to recent international developments, the DDO has increased its collection activities in the areas of terrorism and international narcotics traffic with considerable success. In the DDI, economic intelligence has continued to assume increased importance and taken on new dimensions. In sharp contrast to the British Intelligence Service, which has for generations emphasized international economics, the DDI only recently has begun developing a capability in such areas as international finance, the gold market, end of page 129, beginning page 130, and international economic movements. The real impetus for this change came in August 1971 with the U.S. balance of payments crisis. Since that time, and with subsequent international energy problems, the demands for international economic intelligence have escalated dramatically. The agency's technological capabilities have made a sustained contribution to policymaking. By providing the first effective means of verification, CIA's reconnaissance systems facilitated the United States' participation in arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, beginning with the 1972 interim agreement limiting strategic arms. In December 1974, these developments and impetus for change began under Schlesinger were overtaken by public revelations of alleged CIA domestic activities. What had been a consensual acceptance of the CIA's right to secrecy in the interests of national security was rejected. The agency's vulnerability to these public revelations was indicative of the degree to which American foreign policy and the institutional framework that supported that policy were undergoing redefinition. Conclusion. A brief history cannot catalog the many shifts in the numerous CIA subdivisions over a period of nearly 30 years. Instead, this summary has attempted to capture the changes in the CIA's main functional areas, sharing characteristics common to most large, complex organizations. The CIA has responded to, rather than anticipated, the forces of change it has accumulated, functions rather than redefining them. Its internal patterns were established early and have solidified. Success has come to those who have made visible contributions in high priority areas. These general characteristics have affected the specifics of the agency's development. The notion that the CIA could serve as a coordinating body and that the Director of Central Intelligence could orchestrate the process did not take into account inherent institutional obstacles, vested departmental interests, and the department's control over budget and management choices frustrated the agency's and the DCI's ability to execute the coordination function. These limitations exist today when the resources and complexities of administration have escalated dramatically. The DDO and the DDI evolved out of separate, independent organizations serving different policy needs. Strict compartmentation in the DDO reinforced the separation. The two components were not mutually supportive elements in the collection and analysis functions. The activities of the clandestine service have reflected not what the agency can do well, but what the demands of American foreign policy have required at particular times. The nature of covert operations, the priority accorded them by senior policymakers, and the orientation and background of some DCIs have made the clandestine mission the preeminent activity within the organization. The qualities demanded of individuals in the clandestine service, essentially management of people, provide the basis for bureaucratic skills in this organization. These skills account for the fact that those DCIs who have been agency careerists have all come from the DDO. End of page 130. Beginning page 131. Growth in the range of American foreign policy interests and the DDI's response to additional requirements have resulted in an increase of collection and analysis. Rather than rectifying the problem of duplication, the agency has contributed to it by becoming yet another source of intelligence production. The DDI's size and the administrative process involved in the production of finished intelligence precluded a close association between policymakers and analysts, between the intelligence product and the policy informed by intelligence analysis. The relationship between intelligence analysis and policymaking is a reciprocal one. The creation of the National Intelligence Officer system was in part a recognition of the need for close interaction between analysts and their clients. If intelligence is to influence policy, and if policy needs are to direct intelligence priorities, senior policymakers must actively utilize the intelligence capabilities at their disposal. For policymakers not to do so only wastes resources and encourages lack of direction in intelligence production. Likewise, the Director of Central Intelligence, or his successor for management of the community, must assign priority attention to the roles of Principal Intelligence Advisor, to the President and Head of the Intelligence Community, History has demonstrated that the job of the DCI as community manager and as senior official of the agency are competing, not complementary roles. In the future, separation of the functions may prove a plausible alternative. Clandestine services will remain an element of U.S. foreign policy, and policymakers will directly affect the level of operations. The prominence of the clandestine service within the agency may moderate as money for and high-level executive interest in covert action diminishes. However, DDO incentives, which emphasize operations over collection and which create an internal demand for projects, will continue to foster covert action unless an internal conversion process forces a change. Over the past 30 years, the United States has developed an institution and a corps of individuals who constitute the U.S. intelligence profession. The question remains as to how both the institution and the individuals will best be utilized. End of page 131, beginning page 132. 7. The Central Intelligence Agency, Statutory Authority. The National Security Act of 1947 provides the Central Intelligence Agency with statutory authority for its activities. Section 102D of that act lists the following, quote, powers and duties, end quote, for the agency. 1. To advise the National Security Council in matters concerning such intelligence activities of the government departments and agencies as relate to national security. 2. To make recommendations to the National Security Council for the coordination of such intelligence activities of the departments and agencies of the government as relate to national security. 3. To correlate and evaluate intelligence relating to the national security and to provide for the appropriate dissemination of such intelligence within the government using, where appropriate, existing agencies and facilities, provided that the agency shall have no police, subpoena, law enforcement powers, or internal security functions. Provided further that the departments and other agencies of the government shall continue to collect, evaluate, correlate, and disseminate departmental intelligence, and provided further that the Director of Central Intelligence shall be responsible for protecting intelligence sources and methods from unauthorized disclosure. 4. To perform, for the benefit of the existing intelligence agencies, such additional services of common concern as the National Security Council determines can be more efficiently accomplished centrally. 5. To perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may from time to time. Footnote 1. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 1. 50 U.S.C. 403D. Resuming the reading. The CIA has engaged in the following 3 types of activities, none of which is specifically mentioned in the 1947 legislation. 1. Direct clandestine collection of intelligence. 2. Covert action. And 3. Direct collection of information regarding the activities of American nationals within the United States. As the fact of the CIA involvement in these activities has become widely known, questions have been raised regarding the statutory authority by which the agency undertook these responsibilities. It is important to note at this point that the confusion which has resulted from the lack of specific legislative guidelines with respect to these 3 kinds of activities must rest with Congress. The language of the National Security Act its legislative history, and the post-enactment interpretation of the legislation by Congress itself indicates that the act can legitimately be constructed as authorizing clandestine collection by the CIA. The Select Committee's record shows that the legislating committees of the House and Senate intended for the act to authorize the agency to engage in espionage. This activity could and should have been specifically authorized in the 1949 legislation. End of page 132. Beginning page 133. Authority for covert action cannot be found in the National Security Act. The committee finds that the executive branch should have approached Congress for authority or the CIA to engage in such activities, particularly where they involve the use of force. At the same time, Congress should have acted in response to well-publicized instances of covert action to clarify CIA authority in this area. Finally, Congress did take decisive action in the National Security Act of 1947 to prevent the CIA's assuming any police, law enforcement, or internal security function in the United States. Some of the CIA's activities have been in clear violation of that principle. Congress now has the responsibility, however, to clarify the agency's authority where the CIA's domestic activities are directly linked to its foreign intelligence responsibilities. A. Clandestine collection of intelligence. While the National Security Act of 1947 authorizes correlation, evaluation, and dissemination of national security intelligence by the CIA, nowhere does it specify that the agency is authorized to engage in the direct collection of intelligence. As its authority to engage in direct collection, the CIA has relied upon Section 102D, 4 and 5 of the Act. Footnote 1A. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 1A. Memorandum from the CIA General Counsel to the Director, May 7, 48. Memorandum from the CIA General Counsel to the Deputy Chief for Foreign Intelligence, April 14, 61. Resuming the reading. So this act, which authorizes the agency, 4, to perform for the benefit of the existing branches such additional services of common concern as the National Security Council determines, can be more efficiently accomplished centrally. 5. To perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may from time to time direct. 50 U.S.C. 403D, 4 and 5. The legislative history of the 1947 Act does not indicate clearly that the full Congress specifically intended by these provisions to authorize direct clandestine collection by the CIA. The legislating committees discussed the issue in some detail in the executive session, but it was mentioned only briefly in public hearings and floor debates. However, the public record does suggest that the full Congress had access to public information, which indicate that the act could be constructed as an authorizing direct collection. No action was taken to prohibit such activity. Moreover, the 1949 enactment of the the Central Intelligence Agency Act demonstrates congressional intent to facilitate clandestine activities, and thus congressional endorsement of the view that such activities were the legitimate function of the CIA. The committee has been able to locate full records for only one of the closed committee meetings on the National Security Act. In transcript of the June 27, 1947 meeting of the House Committee on Expenditures in the Executive Departments, executive branch representatives proposed centralization of clandestine collection in the CIA. The committee discussed the wisdom of this proposal with a number of End of page 133, beginning page 134. Witnesses, footnote 2. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 2. Transcript, House Committee on Expenditures in Executive Departments. Hearings on H.R. 2319. June 2747. Hereinafter cited as House Transcript, pages 10 through 19, 53 through 55, 79 through 86, 110 to 112, 118 to 125, 134 to 135, 159 to 164. Resuming the reading. General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, then Director of Central Intelligence, suggested centralized collection to the Senate Committee on the Armed Forces. Footnote 3. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 3. Testimony of General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, Director of Central Intelligence. Unsanitized, now declassified. Senate Armed Services Committee. Hearings on S. 758. April 29th, 47. Resuming the reading. In addition, a 1961 memorandum with Houston and former CIA Legislative Counsel Walter Forsheimer indicate that the possibility of including language in the Act specifically to authorize espionage by the CIA was discussed. Footnote 5. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 5. Memorandum from the CIA General Counsel to the Deputy Chief for Foreign Intelligence. April 14, 61. Staff Summary of Lawrence Houston Interview. June 4th, 75. Staff Summary of Walter Forsheimer Interview. May 20th, 75. No discussion of such a proposal is reported in the public record, but the House Committee Executive Session transcript contains brief references to it. Alan Dulla's testimony. House transcript, page 59. Resuming the reading. According to Houston and Forsheimer, this proposal was rejected on the grounds that it would be inappropriate for the United States to be on record as a participant of this kind of activity. Footnote 6. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 6. Houston, Staff Summary. June 4th, 75. And I will stop here for this recording.